I am Julian, 27 years old. For the past 2 years, I secretly funded my entire family's luxurious lifestyle, paying out exactly $9,600 every single month to keep them from absolute financial ruin. Last Thanksgiving, while I was hosting them in my very first home, my father stood up at the head of my own dining table, pointed his finger right at my face, and screamed that I was no longer part of his family. He told me to get out of his sight. My mother sat right next to him, sipping her wine, and whispered that I was just a bitter disappointment who was horribly jealous of my older brother. They humiliated me in front of my cousin, my brother's pregnant wife, and her incredibly wealthy father. But there was one massive secret they did not know. The country club membership my father used to network, the luxury credit cards my brother was maxing out, and the brand new Porsche Cayenne my mother drove to my house that very afternoon were all paid for by me. And while they were demanding I leave my own dining room, they were completely unaware that my tech company was currently finalizing the acquisition of my brother's entire corporate firm. Now, they are facing police encounters, repossessed vehicles, and absolute chaos. Before I tell you exactly how I burned their fake empire to the ground, hit that like button if you believe toxic parents need to face the consequences of their actions. And please, drop a comment letting me know what city or state you are watching from today. Your support means the world to me. Now let us go back to where it all started. The click of my computer mouse echoing in my silent home that Thanksgiving night was the sharpest, most satisfying sound I have ever experienced. I sat alone in the glow of my monitor, logging into the anonymous limited liability company account I had created specifically to save my family from bankruptcy. I navigated to the recurring payments tab. With one single click, I canceled the autopay for my father's country club dues. With the second click, I terminated the payments on my mother's Porsche lease. With the third, I shut down the account feeding my brother's credit card minimums. My house still smelled like roasted sage, expensive red wine, and the lingering scent of my mother's overwhelming perfume. Outside, the Boston winter wind was howling, rattling the windows of the beautiful craftsman home I had bought with my own hard-earned money. Inside my chest, the crushing anxiety that had dictated my entire existence was completely gone. I had spent 2.5 decades running a marathon where the finish line kept moving. I thought if I just paid the right bills, cooked the perfect turkey, smiled through the insults, and kept my massive financial success a secret to protect my father's fragile ego, I would finally earn a seat at the table. Instead, I got publicly humiliated in my own home. So I took my seat back, and I took my money with it. To truly understand how a simple holiday dinner turns into a police incident by sunrise, you have to understand the man who raised me. My father, Victor, is a 52-year-old corporate lawyer who treats his family members like a board of directors he is constantly trying to impress and manipulate. Growing up in our affluent suburban Boston neighborhood, appearances were not just important. They were our religion. We had the perfectly manicured lawn, the glossy holiday cards sent to hundreds of associates, and a strict internal hierarchy. If you were not adding to the family's prestige, you were a complete liability. My mother, Helen, learned extremely early in their marriage that the easiest way to survive Victor's explosive temper was to agree with him completely. She traded her backbone for country club lunches, expensive jewelry, and a life of comfortable, heavily medicated anxiety. She loved her children, but she loved her financial security much more. She would never defend us if it meant standing in the line of Victor's fire. Then there is Sebastian, my older brother, the undeniable golden child of the family. 30 years old, a Harvard Business School graduate, and married into an old-money real estate family. Sebastian was the exact replica of everything my father ever wanted to be. He wore the bespoke suits, he played the right golf courses, and he mirrored my father's ruthless arrogance with terrifying accuracy. In Victor's eyes, Sebastian could do absolutely no wrong. And then there was me. I was the spare part, the disappointment. I went to a state college, worked in what my father constantly referred to as meaningless tech startups, and dated a brilliant, compassionate high school English teacher named Clara instead of a hedge fund heiress. My entire childhood was a series of unfavorable comparisons. When Sebastian got a B on a calculus test, Victor said the teacher was incompetent and demanded a meeting with the principal. When I got an A in the same class 2 years later, Victor said the curriculum had obviously been dumbed down. I learned very early that love in our household was entirely conditional. The currency was prestige, and I was flat broke in their eyes. I spent 2 decades running on a treadmill, chasing a pat on the back that was never going to come. But human beings are fundamentally wired to seek validation from the people who raised them. It is a primal, devastating flaw. Even as an adult, making my own salary, paying my own mortgage, building my own life, I still found myself craving his approval. That desperate, pathetic need for validation is exactly what led me to host Thanksgiving. Traditionally, my mother hosted the holidays in their massive colonial home. It was always a high-stress event focused entirely on impressing whatever wealthy clients or partners Victor decided to invite. But this year I had just purchased my first house. It was not a sprawling mansion. It was a modest, beautiful 3-bedroom craftsman home that I paid for completely in cash. I thought hosting the family would be my ultimate proof of adulthood. I wanted Victor to walk through my front door, eat the food I prepared with my own hands, and finally admit he was proud of the man I had become. As I stared at the digital calendar on my kitchen island, counting down the days to the 3rd Thursday in November, I felt a heavy, sickening knot in my stomach. My girlfriend Clara noticed it immediately. She told me I was setting myself up for complete heartbreak. She warned me that you cannot force people to respect you if they are fully committed to misunderstanding you. But I brushed her off. I was thoroughly convinced that this Thanksgiving would be the ultimate turning point. I was going to serve them a meal so perfect, in a home so welcoming, that they would have no choice but to see my value. I was so incredibly wrong. The foundation of my family's dynamic was built on a massive, highly expensive lie. And the worst part of it all is that I was the one actively funding the delusion. To understand the absolute explosion at the Thanksgiving table, I have to confess the secret I had been keeping for 2 long years. When I graduated from a public university 5 years ago, my father flatly refused to attend the ceremony. He told me over a brief phone call that state schools were nothing more than glorified community colleges. He said he was not going to waste a perfectly good Saturday watching me receive a participation trophy. I remember standing in my cheap polyester cap and gown on the campus green, watching hundreds of other families take pictures, hug their kids, and celebrate. I held a diploma that felt like a burning symbol of my failure. Sebastian, of course, had his Ivy League tuition fully covered by my parents' massive college fund. I took out federal student loans and worked 3 brutal jobs just to pay for my textbooks and rent. But I was exceptionally good at what I did. I went straight into the tech sector, specifically focusing on back-end software development for financial logistics. I told my family I was just a mid-level marketing manager at an unstable tech startup. My father loved to mock my career choice. He constantly asked when I was going to get a real job, maybe something in real estate or corporate law where I could actually earn a respectable salary. What he did not know, what absolutely nobody in my family knew, was that I was not an employee at that startup. I was the co-founder and the majority shareholder. By the time I was 25, my company had secured massive venture capital funding. We built an algorithm that revolutionized how mid-sized financial firms handled their daily logistics. My personal net worth had quietly surpassed my father's entire lifetime earnings. But I kept my lifestyle aggressively modest. I drove a reliable Japanese sedan, bought a reasonable house in a quiet neighborhood, and lived well below my means. I wanted peace, not attention. My father, on the other hand, was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. 2 years ago, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a birthday gift for my mother. Victor was not home. I walked into his home office to leave the gift on his desk, and I saw an opened letter sitting right on top of his leather blotter. It was a final notice from a high-stakes collection agency. Victor had made a series of terrible, highly leveraged real estate investments. The prestige he guarded so fiercely was nothing but a fragile house of cards. He was thousands of dollars behind on his country club dues. My mother's luxury car lease was about to be officially terminated. They were weeks away from losing the image they had spent 30 years cultivating. The thought of my father facing public humiliation, facing the laughter of the country club elite he so desperately worshipped, actually broke my heart. Despite years of emotional abuse, I still loved him. I still harbored this foolish, childish dream of being the son who swooped in and saved the day. So I did something incredibly stupid. I contacted a private lawyer in a different city and set up an anonymous limited liability company. I routed money through a former, retired colleague of my dad's to make it look like Victor was receiving a highly lucrative consulting retainer for his past legal expertise. It was a neat little legal trick that required a sharp lawyer to execute properly, but it worked perfectly. Through this phantom retainer, I started paying $9,600 every single month to keep my parents afloat. I paid for the country club. I paid off Sebastian's lingering credit card debt because my parents were co-signers and his reckless spending was tanking their credit scores. And, most significantly, I took over the exorbitant monthly payments for my mother's brand new Porsche Cayenne. My father strutted around family gatherings boasting about his exclusive new consulting gig, talking about his high salary, while I sat quietly at the table, eating cold appetizers and watching them drink expensive wine that I had secretly purchased. Clara found out about the payments exactly 6 months before Thanksgiving. We were looking for a specific tax document in my home office, and she accidentally opened the digital ledger for the LLC. She is a high school teacher. She is incredibly grounded, fiercely practical, and fiercely protective of me. She stared at the numbers on the screen, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. She turned to me and asked why I was subsidizing the lives of people who treated me like dirt on their shoes. I gave her some pathetic, mumbled excuse about family loyalty. I told her I could not bear to see my mother lose her car or my father face a devastating lawsuit from his creditors. Clara looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and deep anger. She told me I was not helping them. She said I was just funding my own abuse. She said I was paying a premium monthly subscription fee for their disrespect. I hated it when she was right, but I refused to stop the payments. The stress of keeping this massive financial secret, combined with my father's constant belittling, was slowly eating me alive. At work, things were simultaneously reaching a boiling point. We were in the final, highly confidential stages of a massive corporate acquisition. My tech company was actually in the process of buying out the struggling financial firm where my brother Sebastian worked as a middle manager. Sebastian spent every single Sunday dinner bragging about his high-powered executive role. He loved to talk down to me about corporate strategy, completely unaware that his firm was failing miserably and that I was currently reviewing the legal paperwork to absorb his entire department. My business partner, Marcus, was a sharp, no-nonsense CEO who knew my entire family situation. Marcus found it absolutely hilarious that I was keeping my identity a secret from the brother who constantly insulted my intelligence. Marcus promised he would drop by my house on Thanksgiving evening to have me sign the final acquisition documents in person. Meanwhile, I was dealing with Gareth, a senior developer at my company who did not know I was the actual owner. Gareth was a classic corporate bully. He constantly tried to dump his heavy workload on me right before major holidays. He sent me an aggressive email the week of Thanksgiving demanding I finish a massive coding project by Friday morning. I was already highly stressed about the turkey, the house cleaning, and the impending family politics. I politely replied to Gareth, telling him the project would have to wait until Monday. Gareth immediately CC'd the entire department, threatening to report me to executive management for gross insubordination. He wrote that my lack of dedication was the reason I would never get a promotion. I simply smiled at my monitor, forwarded his aggressive email directly to Marcus with a short note to terminate Gareth's contract the Monday after the holiday, and went back to meticulously planning my Thanksgiving menu. The tension in my chest was becoming unbearable. I was holding too many explosive secrets. I was the secret benefactor keeping my parents out of bankruptcy court. I was the secret boss about to own my golden child brother's entire company. Yet, in their narrow eyes, I was still just Julian, the massive disappointment. I somehow convinced myself that if I could just pull off this one perfect Thanksgiving dinner, they would finally see me as an equal. The delusion was incredibly powerful. The week leading up to Thanksgiving felt less like holiday preparation and more like a high-stakes military operation. I took 3 full days off work just to prepare my house. I scrubbed baseboards in the guest bathroom that absolutely nobody would ever look at. I polished every piece of silverware until my hands smelled permanently like metal and harsh chemicals. I rearranged the living room furniture 4 different times trying to make the space look larger, knowing my father would immediately judge the square footage the second he walked through the door. Clara came over on Tuesday night with takeout boxes and found me on my hands and knees in the kitchen, scrubbing the grout lines between the tiles with an old toothbrush. She gently took the toothbrush out of my cramping hand and pulled me up from the floor. She told me I was completely spiraling. She reminded me that normal, loving families do not require a white-glove health inspection before they sit down to eat a turkey. I snapped at her. The pressure was getting to me. I told her she did not understand my family, that Victor noticed every single flaw, and that any small mistake would be used as ammunition to completely ruin the night. Clara just looked at me sadly. She told me that if my father needed spotless kitchen grout to love me, then his love was absolutely not worth earning. Her words stung deeply, mostly because a quiet part of my brain knew she was entirely right, but I was too deep in my own obsession to stop the train. Wednesday was an absolute nightmare. The local grocery stores were chaotic war zones. I had created a meticulously organized spreadsheet for my shopping, categorized by store aisle, but the sheer panic of the holiday crowd threw off my entire system. I went to 3 different high-end supermarkets trying to find the specific organic, heritage breed turkey my mother always raved about at the country club. By the time I finally got home, exhausted and carrying 10 heavy grocery bags, I realized I had forgotten the fresh cranberries and the highly specific, imported brand of sparkling water my father demanded at every single meal. I sat down heavily on my kitchen floor, surrounded by expensive groceries, and I actually cried. It was pathetic. I was a millionaire CEO crying over sparkling water because I was terrified of a 52-year-old man's disapproval. Clara found me sitting there. She did not judge me. She just wiped my face, kissed my forehead, and calmly walked right back out to the store to get exactly what I missed. She was my anchor, and I felt terrible that I was dragging her right into the center of my family's storm. Thursday morning arrived with a bitter, biting chill in the Boston air. My alarm went off at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. The massive turkey needed to go in the oven early to ensure it was perfectly roasted by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I meticulously seasoned the bird, stuffed it with fresh herbs, rubbed expensive butter under the skin, and placed it carefully into my pristine, brand-new smart oven. I set the temperature, verified the digital timer, and took a deep breath. Everything was perfectly on track. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the doorbell rang. It was Aunt Beatrice. Beatrice is my father's older sister, a woman whose entire personality consists of backhanded compliments, passive-aggressive judgment, and a deep obsession with inheritance gossip. She had invited herself over early under the thin guise of helping the bachelor out in the kitchen. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was conducting a preliminary inspection of my home, so she could report any and all failures back to my parents before they even arrived. I let her in, offered her a cup of freshly brewed coffee, and tried to remain as polite as humanly possible. She immediately started critiquing my home decor. She ran her finger over my entryway table and asked if I bought my furniture at a discount warehouse because the wood grain looked incredibly cheap. She asked if I was worried about the resale value of real estate in this modest part of town. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I excused myself and went into the dining room to fold the heavy linen napkins. I left Beatrice alone in the kitchen for exactly 15 minutes. When I walked back in, the kitchen was strangely quiet. The low, comforting, constant hum of the smart oven was completely gone. I rushed over to the display panel. It was completely black. Panic seized my throat. I checked the digital thermometer I had inserted into the turkey. The internal temperature was rapidly dropping. I dropped to my knees and looked behind the massive appliance. The heavy-duty power cord had been physically pulled out of the wall socket. And worse, the mechanical override dial on the back of the oven had been violently twisted past its safety stop. effectively jamming the electronic system. I stood up slowly and looked at Aunt Beatrice, who was innocently sipping her coffee at the kitchen island, looking at her phone. She gave me a sympathetic, overly dramatic sigh. She said it was such a terrible shame that cheap appliances always break down at the absolute worst times. She suggested I just give up, order some pizzas, and prepare to apologize to my father for ruining the holiday. I saw red. Absolute, blinding red. This was not an accident. The plug was deeply recessed into the wall and required serious, deliberate physical force to remove. She had intentionally sabotaged my oven to ensure my dinner was a massive failure, just to give my father something to complain about. She wanted to watch me squirm. She wanted to secure her place in Victor's good graces by serving him my humiliation on a silver platter. I did not scream. I did not throw her out of my house. A strange, freezing cold calm washed over my entire body. I looked Beatrice dead in the eye, my voice entirely flat, and told her the oven must have tripped a breaker. I asked her to wait in the living room while I handled it. The absolute moment she left the kitchen, I pulled out my phone and called Clara. I told her exactly what happened. Clara did not hesitate for a single second. She arrived 20 minutes later carrying 2 heavy-duty extension cords and her expensive outdoor camping gear. Together, we moved in complete, focused silence. We wrestled the partially cooked, incredibly heavy turkey out of the broken oven. Clara fired up my high-end outdoor gas grill on the freezing back patio, meticulously adjusting the burners to create a perfect indirect convection heat environment. We transferred the turkey to the grill, constantly monitoring the temperature with a manual probe. We used the microwave and the stovetop to fiercely manage the side dishes. It was a culinary triage unit. Beatrice peeked her head out the back door window, looking visibly disappointed that I was not having a nervous breakdown on the kitchen floor. I completely ignored her. I gripped the stainless steel handle of the grill, the freezing winter air biting at my face, and made a silent, unbreakable vow. Today they would not break me. Today I was going to serve them a meal fit for royalty, and I was going to force them to acknowledge my effort. I was still playing their twisted game, but the rules were about to change drastically. At exactly 1:30 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang again. The main cast of my personal nightmare had officially arrived. I opened the heavy front door to find Victor, Helen, Sebastian, and his heavily pregnant wife, standing on my front porch. Before anyone even offered a basic greeting, Victor looked up at the ceiling of my entryway and sighed heavily. He loudly remarked to Sebastian that the ceiling height was awfully oppressive and asked how I managed to breathe in such a cramped, depressing space. My house is over 2,000 square feet of open-concept space. It was a calculated insult designed to immediately establish dominance. Helen pushed past me without a hug, carrying 3 large, foil-covered catering trays. I kept my voice perfectly level and asked her what she brought. She gave me a condescending, tight-lipped smile and said she brought a backup turkey and several store-bought side dishes, just in case my little cooking experiment didn't work out. It was a direct, coordinated insult. Aunt Beatrice had clearly texted them about the oven situation while she was sitting in my living room. They came fully prepared to stage a grand rescue mission and rub my nose in my own perceived incompetence. 10 minutes later, the final 2 guests arrived. It was Derek, my younger cousin, and Nathaniel, Sebastian's extremely wealthy father-in-law. Derek was a struggling freelance graphic designer who, just 30 days ago, had practically begged me for a $2,000 loan to cover his rent to avoid eviction. I gave him the money without a single question. Nathaniel was a massive commercial real estate developer, a man Victor constantly tried to impress to gain access to his lucrative social circles. We all moved to the living room for pre-dinner drinks. I served expensive scotch, the exact 20-year-old brand Victor always preferred. As I handed Derek his heavy crystal glass, he looked down at my expensive, authentic Persian rug. He smirked, looked directly at Victor to ensure he had an audience, and loudly asked if I got the rug on clearance at Walmart because the pattern looked a bit cheap and uneven. My own cousin, standing in my house, drinking my expensive liquor, actively mocking me just to gain a shred of favor with my father. I looked at Derek, clearly remembering the frantic, desperate text messages he sent me last month crying about his bank account. I didn't say a single word. I just gave him a slow nod and walked back to the kitchen. At 2:30, I called everyone into the dining room. The table looked like a spread from a high-end culinary magazine. Crystal water glasses, polished silver cutlery, heavy linen napkins, and in the absolute center, a perfectly golden, herb-crusted turkey that Clara and I had miraculously saved on the outdoor grill. I carved the meat flawlessly and served the plates. The silence at the table as everyone took their first bite was heavy and suffocating. I watched Victor closely. He chewed slowly, his brow furrowed in deep, aggressive concentration, actively searching for a flaw. Finally, he swallowed, set his silver fork down on the porcelain plate, and cleared his throat loudly. He announced to the entire table that the turkey was fundamentally dry, the stuffing completely lacked proper sage seasoning, and the mashed potatoes were gluey. It was an absolute, objective lie. The food was spectacular, and he knew it. But admitting that would mean giving me a victory, and Victor never surrenders. Helen immediately chimed in, pushing her plate away with a look of mild disgust and suggesting they go to the kitchen to heat up the backup food she brought. Sebastian laughed loudly, sipping his wine, and said cooking was clearly not my strong suit, which was fine since my career in marketing wasn't exactly setting the world on fire either. The conversation deliberately shifted away from me and centered entirely on Sebastian. Nathaniel clinked his spoon against his crystal glass and proposed a grand toast to his son-in-law. Sebastian proudly announced that he had just received a massive promotion at his financial firm, securing a new senior vice president title, a massive salary bump, and a corner office. The table erupted in applause. Victor beamed with immense pride, loudly calling Sebastian the true legacy of the family. I sat at the end of my own table, gripping the stem of my wine glass so tightly I thought the glass would shatter in my hand. I knew the absolute truth about Sebastian's promotion. My tech company's legal team had acquired the internal HR documents of his firm 2 weeks ago. Sebastian wasn't promoted. His entire department was being dissolved due to gross incompetence and severe financial mismanagement. They moved him to a meaningless administrative role with a fake fancy title just to avoid paying a massive severance package before the corporate buyout was finalized. He was a dead man walking in the corporate world, sitting at my table, bragging about his execution. I tried to politely change the subject. I kept my voice calm and mentioned that my company had also seen some incredible financial growth recently, and I was looking at a major transition by the end of the year. Victor slammed his open hand flat on the dining table. The silverware violently rattled against the plates. He pointed a sharp finger directly at me across the floral centerpiece. He told me to stop embarrassing myself by constantly comparing my trivial little computer job to Sebastian's prestigious career in high finance. He said my constant need for attention was pathetic and exhausting. Clara, who had been sitting perfectly quiet beside me the entire evening, finally had enough. She put her warm hand over my shaking fist, looked directly into Victor's eyes, and said, in a remarkably calm, steady voice, "Julian works incredibly hard, Mr. Victor. He bought this beautiful home entirely by himself. He prepared this incredible meal despite the challenges, and he deserves your respect, especially when you are a guest sitting under his own roof." The entire room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Victor's face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of red. He looked at Clara as if she were a piece of trash he had stepped on. He sneered, his voice dripping with absolute, terrifying venom. "Respect is earned, little girl, and it is certainly not demanded by a public school teacher dating my son for his meager savings. You are nothing but a gold digger trying to secure a comfortable life in a mediocre suburb. Keep your mouth shut when family is speaking." The air in the room completely vanished. Clara froze, her eyes welling with tears she fiercely refused to let fall. Helen looked down at her plate, pretending not to hear. Derek smirked behind his glass. Sebastian shook his head, loudly muttering about Clara being completely out of line. I looked at Clara, the woman who loved me when I had nothing. I looked at the beautiful table I had meticulously set. I looked at the father I had spent 27 years trying to impress, the man whose country club fees, lawyer bills, and luxury car I was secretly paying for every single month out of my own pocket. Something deep inside my chest violently snapped. The desperate, needy child seeking validation died in that exact moment, right there in the dining room. A chilling, absolute silence washed over my brain. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel sad. I felt immensely, terrifyingly powerful. The storm had finally broken, and I was standing in the dead center of the eye. I slowly stood up from my chair, picking up my linen napkin and placing it carefully next to my plate. The payoff was finally here, and I was going to burn their entire fake world to the ground. The air in my dining room turned to absolute ice. The silence was so heavy, so physically oppressive, that I could actually hear the antique grandfather clock ticking out in the hallway. I sat at the head of the table, looking at the faces of the people who shared my blood. My father, Victor, was radiating a level of toxic, unhinged fury that I had not witnessed since I was a terrified teenager. His face was a mottled, dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing against the crisp white collar of his expensive custom-tailored shirt. He had just looked at the woman I loved, the woman who had spent the entire morning saving my Thanksgiving dinner from an act of deliberate sabotage, and called her a gold digger. He told her to keep her mouth shut. He did this in my house. He did this while eating the food I paid for, sitting on the chair I bought under the roof I owned. For 27 years, my primary survival mechanism in the presence of Victor's rage was complete and total submission. When he raised his voice, I lowered my eyes. When he demanded an apology for an offense I did not commit, I gave it to him just to keep the peace. I had been trained, thoroughly and methodically, to believe that my own dignity was a small, reasonable price to pay for family harmony. I fully expected that old, familiar wave of panic to wash over me. I expected my heart to race, my palms to sweat, and my mouth to form the words, "I am sorry." But the panic never came. Instead, a profound, chilling clarity settled over my entire brain. It was as if a thick fog had suddenly lifted from a landscape I had been wandering through blindly for my entire life. I looked at Victor, really looked at him without the lens of childhood fear. I did not see a powerful, intimidating corporate lawyer. I saw a deeply insecure, financially ruined, bitter 52-year-old man projecting his own massive failures onto the only son who was actually keeping him afloat. I looked over at my mother, Helen. She was staring intently at her half-eaten plate of mashed potatoes, aggressively refusing to make eye contact with me, Clara, or anyone else in the room. She was performing her usual routine. See no evil, hear no evil, and above all else, never contradict the man who pays for the country club memberships. Except, of course, Victor was not paying for those memberships. I was. Sebastian, my golden child older brother, broke the heavy silence. He let out a sharp, condescending laugh, leaned back in his chair, and swirled his expensive red wine in his crystal glass. He looked at me with a smirk that made my blood run completely cold. He told me that I needed to control my girlfriend. He said that Clara was acting highly unprofessionally and that if she ever spoke to a senior partner at his financial firm with that kind of tone, she would be fired on the spot. He added that people of my socioeconomic status needed to learn basic respect for their betters. My cousin Derek, the same cousin who had literally begged me for a $2,000 rent loan 30 days prior to avoid a brutal eviction, chuckled and nodded in enthusiastic agreement with Sebastian. Nathaniel, Sebastian's incredibly wealthy real estate developer father-in-law, simply observed the entire exchange with a blank, unreadable expression. Nathaniel was a man who understood power dynamics, and he was currently watching a masterclass in familial dysfunction. I slowly stood up from my chair. The legs of the heavy mahogany chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I picked up my thick linen napkin, folded it neatly into a square, and placed it deliberately next to my pristine china plate. I did not throw it. I did not slam my fists down on the dining table. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. The furious, desperate child inside me who had spent 27 years begging for a scrap of validation was completely dead and gone. In his place stood a man who finally recognized his own immense power. I looked directly at Victor. I kept my voice incredibly flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. I told him he was completely out of line. I told him he was a guest in my home, and he had absolutely no right to speak to my partner with such profound disrespect. I informed him that Clara was worth 10 times the people sitting at this table, and I demanded that he apologize to her immediately. Victor's eyes widened in genuine, unadulterated shock. His supreme authority had never been directly challenged in such a public forum. The shock quickly morphed into an explosive, volcanic rage. He pushed his chair back violently, the heavy wood hitting the wall behind him with a loud crack. He stood up to tower over the table, assuming his classic courtroom intimidation posture. He pointed his finger directly at my face, his voice booming with the practiced theatricality of a seasoned litigator. He screamed that I was an ungrateful, pathetic, miserable disappointment. He yelled that he had given me absolutely everything. He claimed he had provided a luxury roof over my head for 18 years and a prestigious family name that carried weight in the city of Boston. He declared, right there in front of Sebastian, his pregnant wife, Nathaniel, and my snickering cousin Derek, that my career was a complete joke. He said my house was a tiny, depressing starter home for lower-middle-class failures. And then Victor delivered what he truly believed was the final, fatal, devastating blow. He looked me dead in the eye, his face contorted with absolute venom, and stated that I was a disgrace to his legacy. He told me that, as of this exact moment, I was no longer a part of his family. He officially disowned me. He demanded that I get out of his sight, apparently completely forgetting that we were standing in the middle of my own dining room. My mother finally looked up from her plate. She took a slow, elegant sip of her red wine, gave me a condescending, pitying sigh, and whispered that I brought this entirely on myself. She told me I was simply a bitter, resentful child who was horribly jealous of my older brother's incredible corporate success. She said my toxic jealousy was poisoning the entire family dynamic, and that Victor was right to cut me off to protect Sebastian's bright future. The trap of their own complacency had been perfectly set. For years, they operated under the strict assumption that I needed them desperately. They believed my entire self-worth was tied directly to their approval. They thought that the threat of losing my family would bring me to my knees, begging for their forgiveness. They thought the absolute worst punishment they could inflict upon me was to remove my access to their miserable, superficial lives. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the exact key to my own prison cell. I did not cry. I did not yell back. I did not beg my mother to reconsider her cruel words. I actually smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a cold, sharp, terrifying smile that caused the smug expression to instantly vanish from my cousin Derek's face. I looked at my mother, then at my golden child brother, and finally, I locked eyes with Victor. I told them that I completely accepted his terms. I told Victor that if I was officially no longer a part of this family, then I was officially, legally, and morally absolved of all my financial obligations to it. Victor scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively. He mocked my use of the word financial obligations. He asked me what a low-level marketing manager could possibly contribute to a family of highly successful professionals. He told me to stop acting grandiose. I turned my attention directly to Sebastian. He was sitting there looking incredibly smug in his expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single person at the table heard every word clearly. I told Sebastian that since he was the golden child, the true legacy of the Victor bloodline, with his massive new corporate promotion and his impressive new salary, he could immediately take over the $9,600 monthly payment required to keep our parents out of federal bankruptcy court. The dining room went dead. Sebastian blinked, his brain completely unable to process the combination of words I had just spoken. Victor froze, his pointing finger slowly dropping to his side as a flicker of genuine confusion crossed his eyes. Helen almost dropped her crystal wine glass onto her expensive dress. Nathaniel, the incredibly wealthy real estate developer who had built his fortune on recognizing financial leverage, leaned forward in his chair. He was suddenly extremely interested in the conversation. I did not stop. I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket, unlocked it, and opened the secure banking application. I placed the phone flat on the dining table. I told them that I was the sole funder and exclusive owner of the anonymous limited liability company that had been paying Victor's fake legal consulting retainer for the past 2 full years. I listed the monthly expenses out loud, checking them off on my fingers with brutal precision. $3,000 a month for the exclusive golf and country club membership, so Victor could pretend he was still a major player in the corporate world and court wealthy clients like Nathaniel. $2,000 a month for the luxury lease on Helen's brand new Porsche Cayenne, the exact same vehicle sitting proudly in my driveway right now, and $4,600 a month going directly to a high-interest debt consolidation firm. I looked right at Sebastian's pregnant wife, who was suddenly looking very pale. I explained that the $4,600 was paying off Sebastian's secret, massive credit card disaster. Because my parents were co-signers on his exorbitant debts, his reckless spending was actively destroying their credit scores. I told Sebastian that without my monthly wire transfers, his luxury life was an absolute illusion. Victor turned a terrifying, ashen shade of pale. He stammered, desperately trying to utilize his commanding lawyer voice, but it completely failed him. It sounded weak, hollow, and pathetic. He accused me of lying. He called me a psychotic, delusional liar who was making up insane stories just to ruin a family Thanksgiving. He looked at Nathaniel and tried to laugh it off as a desperate cry for attention from a mentally unstable son. Right at that exact, precise second, the doorbell rang. It was not a polite, hesitant holiday ring. It was a firm, heavy, businesslike knock followed by a sustained push on the doorbell. The sound echoed through the silent house like a judge's gavel. I walked out of the dining room, the heavy silence following me like a physical shadow. I opened the front door. Standing on my porch was Marcus, my brilliant business partner and the highly public CEO of our massive tech firm. He was wearing a sharp winter overcoat and holding a thick, heavy, leather-bound legal folder. I invited Marcus into the dining room. He walked in, taking one look at the pale, horrified, frozen faces of my family. Marcus did not hesitate. He is a man who deals in facts, contracts, and acquisitions. He walked straight up to the head of the table, handed me the heavy legal folder, and loudly addressed me as the majority shareholder, founder, and president of our tech firm. He announced, in a clear, booming voice, that the legal paperwork for our latest corporate acquisition was fully finalized, completely approved by the board, and required my immediate signature to execute the takeover. Sebastian's jaw practically unhinged from his face. He recognized Marcus instantly. Anyone working in the Boston financial sector knew exactly who Marcus was. Sebastian looked frantically from Marcus to me, his brain desperately trying to process the impossible, devastating reality crashing down on his head. I opened the leather folder and pulled out the top document. It was printed on heavy, watermarked legal paper. I looked at Sebastian and told him the absolute, unvarnished truth. I told him that my tech company had just finalized the hostile buyout of his entire struggling financial logistics firm. I told him I had personally reviewed the highly confidential human resources restructuring documents. I informed him, in front of his pregnant wife, my parents, and his extremely wealthy father-in-law, that he had not received a promotion. I revealed the exact details of his corporate standing. I explained that his entire department was being permanently dissolved for gross financial incompetence and severe mismanagement of client funds. The only reason he was given a fake vice president title last week was a legal loophole to delay his massive severance package until our acquisition was fully complete. I looked Sebastian dead in the eye. I told him he was effectively unemployed, completely broke, and drowning in massive credit card debt that I was officially no longer going to pay. I told him his career in high finance was completely over. Nathaniel slowly stood up from the table. The look of absolute, unadulterated disgust on his face was something I will never forget for the rest of my life. He looked at Victor, a man who had spent years kissing his shoes, playing golf with him, and bragging about his massive wealth. Then he looked at Sebastian, the man who had married his only daughter under the strict, calculated pretense of being a wealthy, successful executive with a massive, untouchable trust fund. Nathaniel did not yell. Powerful, truly wealthy men rarely need to raise their voices. He simply turned to his pregnant daughter, told her to get her winter coat immediately, and stated that they were leaving. He looked Sebastian up and down like he was a piece of garbage, and calmly announced that he would be contacting his personal team of divorce attorneys first thing in the morning. Victor panicked. He tried to physically stop Nathaniel from leaving. He grabbed Nathaniel's arm, begging him to stay, promising that there was a massive misunderstanding, that I was a disgruntled employee making up lies. Nathaniel violently shoved Victor's hand away. He told Victor that if he ever touched him again, or if he ever tried to contact his family, he would bury him in so much civil litigation he would never see the inside of a courtroom again. I walked over to the front door and pulled it wide open, letting the freezing Boston winter wind rush into my warm house. I looked at Victor, Helen, Sebastian, and my cousin Derek. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I told them to get out of my house. I told them that paying their bills did not make us a family, and that my resignation from the Victor dynasty was officially effective immediately. The sound of my heavy oak front door clicking shut behind them was the most profound, deeply liberating sound I have ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of a heavy, rusted iron chain finally snapping. I stood in my entryway for a long time, just breathing in the quiet, empty space. Clara walked up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her head against my back. She didn't say a single word. She didn't need to. She just held me while the massive adrenaline spike slowly began to fade from my bloodstream, leaving behind a deep, incredible sense of permanent peace. I did not return to the dining room to clear the expensive china. I did not pack away the perfectly roasted turkey into plastic containers. I walked straight into my home office, turned on my high-powered desktop computer, and sat down heavily in my leather desk chair. Clara pulled up a chair right next to me, holding my left hand tightly in hers. I opened the highly secure banking portal for the anonymous LLC. The digital ledger stared back at me, a meticulously organized record of my 2-year financial martyrdom. I navigated directly to the recurring wire transfers menu. I felt absolutely no hesitation. I felt zero guilt. I felt the cold, hard logic of a businessman cutting off a terrible investment. I clicked the red cancellation icon next to the massive country club membership draft. I clicked cancel on the exorbitant Porsche lease payment. I clicked cancel on Sebastian's massive debt consolidation autodraft. I systematically went through every single line item and completely zeroed out the accounts. I transferred the remaining operational balance back into my personal high-yield savings account, and I initiated the formal, irrevocable legal dissolution of the LLC. In less than 10 minutes, sitting in the quiet of my office, I had entirely dismantled the absolute financial foundation of Victor and Helen's completely fabricated reality. They had nothing left but their massive egos and an empty bank account. I leaned back in my chair, looking at my own authentic financial portfolio. My massive salary was entirely secure. My real estate investments were solid and generating passive income. I was completely safe. I had spent so much of my adult life terrified of losing a family that never actually existed in the first place, that I completely forgot to appreciate the incredible, stable life I had built with my own 2 hands. Clara and I spent the rest of the evening sitting on the living room floor, eating thick slices of expensive turkey on cheap paper plates, drinking the rest of the 20-year-old scotch, and laughing until our ribs physically hurt. It was, without a doubt, the best Thanksgiving of my entire life. But the true, absolute chaos did not begin until the sun came up the very next morning. At exactly 7:30 on Black Friday morning, my phone started vibrating relentlessly on my bedside nightstand. I groggily picked it up and looked at the caller ID. It was my younger sister, Fiona. I haven't mentioned Fiona much because she managed to escape the family toxicity very early on. She was 24, living a quiet life across the country in California, and she actively kept her distance from Victor's aggressive control. I answered the phone. Fiona was practically hyperventilating with a chaotic mixture of profound shock and deeply suppressed laughter. She told me I needed to log onto the neighborhood social media group page immediately. Victor and Helen lived in a highly restricted, incredibly snooty gated community governed by a ruthless, militant homeowners association. In their neighborhood, discretion and the appearance of immense wealth were their absolute highest currency. Fiona narrated the events exactly as she received them from a panicked, hysterical, sobbing voicemail our mother had just left her 5 minutes ago. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, a heavy-duty commercial tow truck had backed its massive frame into Victor and Helen's pristine, stamped concrete driveway. The luxury Porsche dealership did not mess around when a high-value lease payment hard-bounced, and the primary guarantor account was officially flagged as closed and dissolved. They didn't send a polite letter. They sent a highly specialized, aggressive repossession team. Helen had woken up to the loud sound of heavy hydraulic chains clanking right outside her master bedroom window. She ran outside into the freezing November morning in her expensive silk bathrobe, screaming hysterically at the men who were actively hooking up the axles of her beloved Porsche Cayenne. Victor followed right behind her, completely unhinged and still wearing his pajamas. He still fiercely refused to believe my declaration at the Thanksgiving table. His narcissism convinced him that my threat was an elaborate, bluffing tactic to gain respect. Victor puffed up his chest and tried to use his status as a former corporate lawyer to aggressively intimidate the repo men. He screamed at the top of his lungs that they were trespassing on private property. He threatened them with massive civil litigation, lawsuits for emotional distress, and demanded they unhook the luxury vehicle immediately. The repo men, who deal with angry, completely broke people every single day of their lives, completely ignored his legal jargon, secured the heavy chains, and continued winching the SUV onto the flatbed. Victor, blinded by his own towering, fragile arrogance, made a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911, screaming to the dispatcher that he was reporting an active, violent vehicle theft in progress at his residence. Because of the affluent zip code, 3 local police cruisers arrived at the house within 4 minutes. Their lights were flashing brightly, sirens wailing loudly, completely waking up the entire wealthy cul-de-sac. Neighbors in expensive cashmere pajamas stepped out onto their perfectly manicured front lawns, clutching their morning coffees, watching the unbelievable spectacle unfold in real time. Mrs. Gable, the notoriously gossipy head of the HOA, was standing right on her porch with her phone out, clearly recording the entire incident. The police officers quickly separated Victor from the tow truck drivers. The lead repo agent calmly reached into his jacket and handed the commanding officer the official bank repossession order, complete with the failed payment logs, the immediate termination notice of the anonymous LLC guarantor, and the dealership's legal right to reclaim the asset. The officer meticulously reviewed the legal documents with a flashlight. He looked at the screaming, red-faced Victor, handed the papers back to the driver, and bluntly informed my father that the repossession was entirely lawful, civil, and completely out of police jurisdiction. Victor completely lost his mind. He started screaming at the police officers, aggressively calling them incompetent, underpaid mall cops, and demanding they arrest the drivers immediately. He stepped aggressively toward the commanding officer, pointing his finger right in the cop's face, utilizing the exact same physical intimidation tactic he used on me the night before in my dining room. The officer did not flinch. He did not back down. He immediately unclipped his heavy metal handcuffs from his belt, rested his hand on his utility belt, and sternly warned Victor that if he did not step back and lower his voice that exact second, he would be thrown to the ground and arrested on the spot for disorderly conduct, threatening a police officer, and interfering with a lawful commercial repossession. Right there in the freezing cold, in front of the president of the HOA, in front of the wealthy neighbors he had spent 3 decades trying to impress, manipulate, and outshine. Victor was publicly humiliated, legally humbled, stripped of his power, and threatened with actual jail time. Helen collapsed onto the wet, manicured grass in her silk robe, sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands as the massive tow truck pulled her ultimate status symbol out of the driveway and hauled it down the affluent street. The illusion was completely, irreparably shattered. There was no secret, lucrative legal consulting gig. There was no massive generational wealth. There was only a terrifying mountain of high-interest debt, a repossessed luxury car, and a neighborhood full of wealthy gossips who now knew the absolute, unvarnished truth. I listened to Fiona tell the entire story, staring quietly at the ceiling of my bedroom. My mother had left me 3 frantic, completely unhinged voicemails begging me to fix the terrible bank error, claiming that the massive inheritance she planned to leave me one day would be severely compromised if I didn't wire them money immediately. I deleted the voicemails without listening past the first 5 seconds. There was no inheritance. There never was an inheritance. There was only the heavy, suffocating burden of their lies, their manipulation, and their emotional abuse. And I had finally, permanently, put that burden down. The massive fallout over the next several weeks was swift, incredibly brutal, and entirely deserved. When you build an entire life on a shaky foundation of lies, financial manipulation, and the emotional exploitation of your own child, the eventual collapse leaves absolutely no survivors. Sebastian's fake corporate world imploded first. The Monday directly following Thanksgiving, my tech company officially absorbed his failing financial firm. I did not involve myself in the lower-level human resources terminations. I let Marcus handle the brutal execution. Sebastian was formally terminated without cause. His desk was packed into a cheap cardboard box by noon, and he was escorted out of the glass building by building security. But losing his fake vice president job was the absolute least of his mounting problems. Nathaniel, his incredibly wealthy and highly protective father-in-law, did not make empty threats at my dining table. He launched a full-scale, aggressive financial and private investigation into Sebastian's background. His team of lawyers discovered the massive mountain of high-interest credit card debt, the fabricated promotional titles, the hidden loans, and the absolute lack of any actual trust fund or college fund safety net that Sebastian had heavily implied he possessed to marry into their family. Nathaniel's daughter, furious, heartbroken, and feeling completely betrayed by a manipulative man who married her under incredibly false pretenses, immediately moved back into her parents' massive, highly secure estate. Nathaniel hired the most ruthless, expensive family law attorney in the entire state of Massachusetts. Sebastian was suddenly facing a highly aggressive, deeply punitive divorce proceeding. He was completely cut off from the wealthy lifestyle he felt so deeply entitled to, and he was staring down the barrel of a brutal legal battle for custody of his unborn child, knowing he didn't have a single dollar to pay a competent lawyer to represent him in family court. Sebastian desperately tried to call me twice the following week. He left pathetic, crying voicemails begging for a short-term brotherly loan to secure legal counsel. I blocked his number from my phone provider. He confidently made his bed at my dining table when he mocked my career. Now he had to sleep in it. Victor and Helen's entire social empire crumbled into fine dust within a matter of days. The exclusive country club, having received a hard bounce on their massive monthly dues from the now-dissolved LLC, immediately revoked their membership privileges. Their key fobs were deactivated. They were completely locked out of the very institution they used to define their social worth and network for survival. Helen's so-called friends in the gated neighborhood quickly distanced themselves after the highly public, embarrassing police incident with the repo truck. Gossip in those affluent circles is a highly contagious terminal disease, and my parents were officially patient zero. In the middle of December, exactly 2 weeks before the holidays, I received a lengthy, incredibly manipulative email from Victor. It was an absolute masterclass in narcissistic gaslighting. He did not offer a single genuine apology for his horrific behavior at Thanksgiving. He did not acknowledge the fact that I had secretly funded his life for 2 years. He didn't even mention Clara. Instead, he wrote that the family was going through a temporary, highly stressful transitional phase, and that it was my fundamental duty as a son to step up, show loyalty, and support my parents in their time of need. He formally invited Clara and me to their house for a small Christmas Eve dinner, phrasing the invitation as if he were generously granting me a rare, highly coveted opportunity to earn my way back into his prestigious good graces. I read the email while sitting in the comfortable, quiet office of my therapist, Sylvia. I had been working closely with Sylvia for 3 years, slowly and painfully untangling the massive web of emotional abuse and conditional love Victor had woven into my brain since childhood. I read the email out loud to her. When I finished the last sentence, I looked up, fully expecting to feel that familiar, heavy, suffocating sting of guilt in my chest. But I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional cord was permanently severed. I felt like I was reading an email from a complete stranger. Sylvia smiled warmly at me. She pointed out that Victor's email was not an invitation to celebrate a holiday. It was a desperate, calculated summons from a delusional king who simply didn't realize his castle had already burned down to the ground. She asked me what I wanted to do about it. For the first time in my entire adult life, the answer was incredibly simple, crystal clear, and completely devoid of any fear. I opened my laptop right there on Sylvia's couch and typed my reply. I kept it to 3 short, legally precise sentences. I told Victor that I did not recognize his authority over my life, I did not accept his twisted version of reality, and I would absolutely not be attending Christmas or any future gatherings. I stated that my financial and emotional boundaries were now permanently, irrevocably closed, and that any further attempts to contact me for money, loans, or favors would be forwarded directly to my legal team as actionable harassment. I hit send, closed the heavy aluminum lid of the laptop, and took a deep, grounding breath. The heavy, dark cloud of anxiety that had followed me since childhood completely evaporated. I was finally truly free. Christmas arrived in Boston wrapped in a beautiful blanket of quiet, peaceful snow. The stark contrast between my current reality and the chaotic, deeply miserable holidays of my past was staggering. I did not spend the month of December stressed out of my mind, desperately trying to buy wildly expensive gifts to win the fleeting, conditional approval of people who fundamentally despised me. I did not sit through agonizing, tense dinners listening to Victor brag about his fake wealth or listening to Sebastian aggressively mock my tech career. Instead, Clara and I started our very own traditions. We hosted an intimate, beautiful Christmas Eve dinner right at my house. The guest list was small, carefully curated, and completely drama-free. Marcus and his brilliant wife came over, bringing an incredible bottle of imported wine to celebrate the successful corporate merger. My sister Fiona flew in all the way from California, completely bypassing our parents' condominium to stay comfortably in my guest room. Even a few close friends from our neighborhood joined us. My house was filled with actual, genuine, booming laughter. There was absolutely no tension hovering over the dining table like a dark cloud. Nobody was inspecting the baseboards for dust or aggressively judging the brand of the sparkling water. We ate amazing food, shared real stories, and celebrated the incredible fact that we had chosen each other. Right after midnight, as the guests were happily finishing their desserts and Fiona was pouring another round of hot coffee, I stood up. I walked over to the stone fireplace, where Clara was sitting warmly on the hearth, watching the crackling flames. I didn't make a massive, theatrical speech. I didn't need a large audience to validate my actions or my love anymore. I just knelt down on one knee in front of the woman who had stood by me when I was terrified, the woman who bravely defended my honor against a monster, and the woman who taught me that true love does not require a pristine kitchen, a perfect turkey, or a massive bank account. I pulled a small velvet box out of my pocket, opened it, and asked Clara to marry me. She burst into happy, overwhelming tears, dropped her coffee mug onto the carpet, and threw her arms around my neck, shouting yes before I could even slide the diamond ring onto her finger. The entire room erupted in massive cheers. Fiona cried openly. Marcus clapped me heavily on the shoulder. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered, incredible joy, completely untainted by the heavy, judgmental shadows of my past. As I held my beautiful future wife in my arms, looking around the living room at the incredible family I had actively chosen to build, I realized something incredibly important. Being publicly disowned by my father was not a punishment. It was the absolute greatest gift he could have ever given me in my entire life. By aggressively kicking me out of his toxic, superficial reality, he forced me to finally recognize my own worth. He pushed me out of a burning building and handed me the keys to my own ultimate freedom. I still occasionally hear rumors through Fiona about the pathetic state of our parents. They had to drastically downsize, moving into a small, cramped condominium miles outside the affluent city limits. Victor is desperately attempting to rebuild his legal consulting practice, but his reputation in the corporate world is deeply, irreparably tarnished. Sebastian is currently navigating a brutal custody battle, working a highly stressful, mid-level sales job just to pay off his massive legal fees and his mounting alimony obligations. They are actively living the exact nightmare they always terrified themselves with. They lost their prestige, they lost their fake wealth, and they lost the only son who was actually willing to blindly support them. I don't feel anger toward them anymore. I don't feel a deep need for revenge, and I certainly don't feel any lingering, toxic guilt. I just feel an overwhelming sense of profound indifference. My life is incredibly full. My tech business is thriving. My future wife is an incredible partner. I broke the generational cycle of abuse, and I am absolutely never looking back. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, uncompromising line in the sand and walk away from the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? Have you ever realized that sometimes the most toxic, dangerous element in your life actually shares your exact DNA? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Remember, your fundamental worth is not defined by the people who are too blind to see it. Protect your peace, build your own table, and absolutely never apologize for walking away from disrespect.